Hey everybody, welcome to the first in a series that we're going to have a look at some classic chess games and things that they've developed in more recent times based on that original classic game. To start off with, going back to the 1850s, a classic that I'm sure some of you are definitely familiar with, the infamous Paul Morphy from America playing against the Duke of Brunswick and Count Isouard from France. This is from 1858. Back in those days, things were a little bit different in the chess world. There weren't the tournaments that you get these days. In those days, it was more of you played somebody in a match. You might have played a few games against someone. Paul Morphy had basically played all the best players in America and won against them. So he went to Europe, wanted a bit of a challenge. The Count and the Duke were both happy to take on his challenge, but the story goes that they could only play on the exact same day. So it turns out that he said, well, that's okay, I'll play you, myself playing against you two as a team. You can talk about your moves and that kind of thing, and we'll play a game. And so they played this game, and interestingly, they also played it while they're actually watching an opera in Paris. But enough of the backstory. Let's get on to the game itself and some of the things we can learn from it. So we start off. Paul Morphy's playing white, and it starts off as a Philidor's defense. Not the best way to protect the pawn on e5. The best way is going to be knight c6 because it doesn't interfere with any of the bishops. The problem with playing a move like d6 is that this bishop over here on f8 is now blocked in. It's only got one possibility rather than, if the pawn's back on d7, it has multiple possibilities of where it might go. So one drawback of that move d6 is it takes away some of those possibilities for the bishop on f8. To take advantage of that, Paul Morphy plays a very logical move d4, and you can already see that Paul Morphy isn't going to have that same problem with his bishops. Both his bishops have clear paths to get out. They can choose any safe square along that diagonal for either of them. And this is where, because we already have a slight disadvantage, Black really needs to be careful about what they do here in this position. There's a few reasonable moves. The main line, knight d7. There's also moves like knight f6 that are possible. You can also take on d4. But in this game, the Count and Duke played bishop g4. On the surface, looks like a good move. You have a pin, you've got a piece the knight that can't move, you have the piece at the back, the queen, that obviously if the knight moves, that's a piece that's potentially in danger. However, in this position, there's a pretty simple tactical flaw with it, that you just take the pawn on e5. Ideally, the Count and Duke would like to recapture, and if they did recapture immediately, Paul Morphy can just trade queens. Now that there's no queen at the back, there's no more pin, so the knight can move, the knight can happily take the pawn, the bishop's in danger, the pawn's in danger, the knight's in the centre, white's a pawn ahead. We've already got a very good position. So to avoid this tactical disaster, we have to do something different as the Count and Duke. And the way they tried to solve the problem was getting rid of the knight, so capturing on f3. Paul Morphy captured with his queen, and now the Count and Duke recaptured with the pawn. And here we have a common theme that I'm sure a lot of beginners have seen in their games. Bishop c4 targeting the weak pawn on f7. Let's make it red. And obviously threatening checkmate in one with queen takes f7, or potentially threatening checkmate in one. Again here, the Count and Duke didn't play the best defence, and this is one thing that you'll see in this game. The Count and Duke don't make any sort of outright really big blunders, but it's a series of small mistakes that kind of add up to what eventually becomes a lost position after not too many moves. In this case, the best move is actually to defend with queen d7, leaving the queen to protect the pawn temporarily, but also allowing the other pieces to develop without being tied down. What happened in the game, they chose to play knight f6, which is a sensible looking move, very natural move to develop a piece and obviously stop the checkmate. However, now white can play queen b3, and this is exactly what Paul Morphy did. One advantage that this does, and this is something that is really good if you can do it in your own games, is that it has two threats. First threat is the big threat, f7, and it's actually threatening checkmate. We'll get to that in a minute. The second threat is to take the unprotected pawn on b7. So there are two threats that black has to deal with. If you don't deal with the big threat, let's say you worry about the small threat, play a move like b6, then bishop takes, king moves, queen e6 is going to be checkmate. So that's the checkmate threat. However, obviously the threat on f7 is a bigger one. So to stop that, black play queen e7. This also sets up a defense. Obviously the pawn on b7 isn't protected, but if white decides to take that pawn on b7, black can now play queen b4 check. Not only is it checking the king, but it's also attacking the queen. So white's really got no choice. It saves the rook. White makes a straight queen for queen. Black can probably just block with the pawn. But white's got a better position. They're a pawn up, but black is by no means out of the game entirely. However, going back to queen e7, rather than snatching this b7 pawn, Paul Morphy again playing another very, very sensible logical move, knight to c3. Not only preventing b4 from being a check, developing a piece, protecting the pawn on e4 that's attacked by the knight. So doing a number of things with one move. And again, this is something that separates the really top chess players from everybody else. Being able to do multiple things in one move. Now, the threat to the b7 pawn is real. To protect that pawn, there's really only one way that you can do it, and you have to move that c7 pawn. In this case, the counter duke moved their pawn up to c6. Again, that's got other problems because now the knight on b8, again, doesn't have that c6 square. So knight c6, a sensible developing move for that knight is not available. And here, this is where we can start to see the problem with black's position. We've got a number of pieces that are still on their starting squares. The best piece on the board for attack, the queen, is stuck protecting two pawns. And the one really good piece that black has is the knight on f6. And this leads white to make the next really good move, bishop g5, pinning that knight, stopping it from moving. So you've got a piece that doesn't want to move. You've got four pieces that haven't moved. You've got the best attacking piece that's stuck behind a pin, protecting two pawns. So black's big pieces really aren't doing anything, aren't doing as much as they possibly can. On the other side of things, you've got white with knights, bishops, queens, all in very, very good attacking positions. White's ready to castle, getting their rooks into the game, and ready to take control of this position. This is where the counter duke tried something to get out of it. Obviously, it didn't work for them. Otherwise, this is one of the reasons why this game is famous. But what actually happened here is they played b5. In some respects, it's a good try for trying to get out of the position. I mean, if white does just drop their bishop back and play a move like bishop d3 or something like that, bishop e2, then black's got time to untangle their pieces. They can play a move like knight d7, maybe queen e6 or queen d6 or even queen b4, something like that. Try and trade some pieces, clear out some space for their pieces that haven't developed yet, try and get their king safe by castling, things like that, and try and get back into the game that way. However, in this position, Paul Morphy has a very, very good response. Knight takes b5. The counter duke really don't have much choice apart from to capture that knight. Otherwise, they've just lost a pawn for nothing and they've got a bad position to boot. But after bishop takes, now we see the real problem, that the king is the piece that is in serious danger for black. Obviously, the knight's pinned. The knight on f6 at least is pinned, so it doesn't want to block. The queen doesn't want to block because you lose the queen. If the king moves to d8, that means that the king's going to be stuck in the centre. It's not going to be able to castle later on in the game, and that's what black would really like to be able to do. Move this bishop out of the way and castle it, try and get their king to some kind of safety. So that really only leaves knight c6, which is giving away a free knight, or knight b to d7 as the only real way to get out of the check safely. But again, this is where we have our problem. We have one pin this way, this knight's pin, another pin this way, this knight's pin. And one thing to do with pins, to take advantage of them, is to attack the pin pieces again. So in this case, Paul Morphy plays another fantastic move, and he castles on the queen side. Immediately, not only getting his king to safety, bringing his rook to d1, helping build up pressure on that knight on d7 that's pinned and can't move. The counter duke realise they're in a bit of danger. They play rook to d8 to defend that knight, and this is a position that will come back to in future episodes. And here Paul Morphy plays rook takes d7. Yet another sacrifice, this time taking advantage of the fact that Black can't bring many more defenders to d7. So after rook takes and rook d1, Black's stuck. They can't find another way to protect that rook. The king, with two pieces attacking, doesn't defend. The knight is still pinned. The queen is a pretty bad defender. It's more of an attacking piece. And this is where Black's in real trouble. To try and bail out of the situation, they try queen e6, but unfortunately there's a forcing sequence that ends the game. Starts off with bishop takes d7. The whole idea here for the counter duke is now that they're out of the pin, they can play knight takes d7. If they play queen takes, again you've got a very, very similar problem. You might just start with queen b8 check. Again, trying to take advantage of the king being in real trouble, and should be able to finish off the game pretty soon after that. So knight takes d7 was played, and this is the famous finish to the game. Again, this is about spotting patterns. In this case, you've got the rook down here on d1. It's going to combine with the bishop on g5. We need to get the rook to d8. What's preventing the rook from getting to d8? The knight on d7. How are we going to get the knight to d7 to move? It doesn't matter what we actually give up to make it happen, as long as we can get that rook to d8, because it's going to be checkmate. So, very famous move, queen to b8 check. Only way out of check is to capture with the knight, and then rook takes d8, checkmate. And again, the final position is really a good example. The only two major pieces that white has, the rook and the bishop, helping combine to make the checkmate. You've got a rook, you've got a bishop, and in this case the king as well. They haven't moved from the start of the game. And the knight on b8 was actually the one that started on g8. It's actually done a little path across here to go from one starting square to the other starting square for the knight. And the queen, yes, it's off the back rank, but it doesn't actually do anything. But really, really famous game, really good example of making use of development, taking advantage of an opponent who doesn't get their pieces out, and setting up some things like a very famous checkmating pattern, as well as taking advantage of pins and other sort of tactical situations. So hopefully you enjoy that. We'll be back in a little while with another follow-up episode to this, continue with this theme of looking at the famous game of Paul Morphy versus the Count and the Duke.